And that's why I don't exclude the possibility of United Ireland coming about in the next generation.
Civil War politics ended a long time ago in our country, but today Civil War politics ends in our Parliament. Leo Varadkar, the former Irish Taoiseach and future Irish Taoiseach, welcomed the coalition between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil with those words. Irish politics had been defined by division, whether it was between the pro-treaty and anti-treaty parties of the Republic, or the north-south divide on the island itself. But the Republic is changing, and as it becomes more economically successful and socially progressive, new political forces are rising up to change the country itself. But what does this mean for the Emerald Isle? And what can Europe and indeed the world learn from Ireland's economic success and its political journey? This week, we spoke to former Irish ambassador to the United Kingdom and to the United States, Daniel Mulhall. Ambassador Mulhall is also the author of Ulysses, A Reader's Odyssey, which takes readers through James Joyce's famous novel, Ulysses. That book is available for purchase now. Alongside Dan, we spoke to Jude Webber, the Dublin correspondent of the Financial Times, about the social and political changes facing Ireland. And for our Patreon subscribers, there is a broader conversation on the prospect of Irish unification. If you would like to hear that conversation, you can subscribe for just €5 a month. We hope you enjoy this episode. Ireland is a country where keen observers of international politics seem to only be aware of its political situation via its relationship to the United Kingdom or through the annual trip to the United States for St. Patrick's Day. But Ireland itself is going through quite an interesting political and social transition at the moment. We're poised for the first handover of the Taoiseach between two parties. That's the equivalent of Prime Minister. Jude, I'm going to start with you. Could you walk us through how we got to this particular moment in Irish politics and what the handover means?
It was a result of the inconclusive 2020 elections, in which the two parties came up with this as a way of clinging on to power. Might be perhaps too harsh a way of putting it, but it certainly looks like that from an outside perspective. That happened before I was here in Ireland. But what they came up with was a plan, a plan with a built-in musical chairs, so that one party of the two main parties, the two Irish Civil War traditional parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, would rotate the big offices of state after, halfway through. So we're coming up to that on December the 15th. They have a smaller coalition party, the Greens Party. Up until now, the coalition, has been hanging together. When I arrived in Ireland about a year ago, people would seem to mutter darkly whenever talking about the coalition, if it lasts that long, meaning if it goes its full term until elections have to be called by February 2025, I think I'm right in saying. And there was some concern that they might not make it until that point. In fact, one of the biggest sort of obstacles to that has been removed, because the current Deputy Prime Minister, Taoiseach, who will take over as Taoiseach or Prime Minister on December the 15th, Leo Varadkar, he was under investigation over a leak of documents to do with doctors' contracts, and that could have resulted in a criminal investigation. And had that done so, he probably would not have been in a position to take over as Taoiseach. But that's been removed by proceedings having been dropped. So now it's sort of full steam ahead to December the 15th when they swap places.
Ambassador, this is quite a unique political coalition for Ireland. For those who are unaware of the history of the Irish Civil War, could you give us the historical background on the relationship between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil? And I do apologise if my pronunciation is off on both of those party names.
I suppose Ireland was traditionally a very unusual political system, because we had two major parties for the best part of 100 years, two major parties and one minor party, the Labour Party, and essentially those two parties alternated in power. But even though they're both centre parties, and if you look at them from a point of view of their political platforms, it's hard to see very much difference between them these days. But historically, the differences, of course, are very profound because it all goes back to the Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921 between the then united Sinn Féin movement, which had conducted the or steered the War of Independence, and the British government, which resulted in a Dominion status being offered to what became the Irish Free State, which became an independent entity or as a Dominion in 1922. That treaty resulted in the hitherto united Irish nationalist Republican movement splitting in two between those who supported the treaty with Britain and those who were against that treaty. And a civil war broke out between the two former parts of Sinn Féin. And one of those parts became Common na Gael, which had government, held office from 1922 to 1932. And the other part, the part that rejected the treaty, remained as Sinn Féin until 1927, when that Sinn Féin split again, and Fianna Fáil was created by Eamon de Valera, who went on to be the Taoiseach Prime Minister of Ireland between 1932 and 1948, so 16 years uninterrupted, and then had two further terms as Taoiseach before he finally retired as Taoiseach and became President of Ireland for 14 years. So there's a long history of these two parties alternating in government. And one of the things that's happened in the last 30 years is that Ireland has become more European also in its politics, because coalition government has now become the norm. Because for a long time, Fianna Fáil were large enough to be a single party in government. So you either had a Fianna Fáil government or you had a government made up of the other parties in the parliament. And now we have a total of 8 or 9 parties. So therefore, forming a coalition becomes more difficult the more you have a diversity of parties, and difficult then to bring together a viable coalition. And so for me at least, the current coalition between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael is a natural, even though it's historically quite a dramatic change. In one sense, it means that this is the last hurdle that's been crossed, and now it appears that any combination of parties is possible in government. The only thing being required is that combination should have a majority of members of our parliament.
Yeah, I was just saying, I mean, any combination of parties, except that all the polls point to Sinn Féin winning the next election, or being the very largest party in the next election, but probably not having an outright majority. And so therefore, the question will be very much who will go into coalition with Sinn Féin. And that seems to be something that the parties are very reticent about committing to at this stage. I mean, Dan has much more of a historical sweep on this, but but what people always tell me is that, you know, Fianna Fáil would probably be the most natural partner, although they're the ones they're distinctly ruling it out at this point. So of course nobody wants to jump too soon, and they don't want to say anything that's being politics. They don't want to back themselves into a corner. But that, you know, who will go into a government with Sinn Féin is, or whether Sinn Féin will be able to put together a coalition of leftist and small parties and have enough votes, that's the next big question.
You've mentioned Sinn Féin a little bit, and they had a very successful result at the last election. Can you talk us through, we had a little bit of the history, but why are they making such inroads now in Irish electoral politics?
One word: housing. Ireland has a massive, massive housing problem. It's a problem of availability and a problem of affordability. So basically, there's not enough supply, and what supply there is too expensive. And it means that young people in particular are finding it very difficult ever to move out and to be able to afford anything. In fact, there's been some polling done recently suggesting that young people, just can't wait to get out of Ireland because they just feel that in many ways it doesn't offer them enough prospects in terms of affordability and cost of living, but housing is a major component of that. So Sinn Féin are basically promising to fix that. It's a very intractable problem. The current coalition has come up with an unprecedented plan in terms of the scale of investment, which they unveiled literally a year ago, last October, which doesn't yet seem to have turned the situation around. I think that's a kind way of putting it. I mean, it's increased the supply, but perhaps not at the rate at which is needed. So Sinn Féin in opposition are able to say all the things that people want to hear. They're tired of parties who've been in government for a long time and individual politicians who've been in government for a long time and whose popularity, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael's popularity, is 20 percentage points lower in the polls than Sinn Féin. So Sinn Féin are really managing to present themselves as this party that will fix the housing problem and therefore appeal to young people, that will be progressive in terms of taxation, and that will, or more progressive. Ireland already has a progressive tax system, but they are promising to tax higher earners more, basically, and that will offer change and a fresh face and a new way of doing things, which I think is appealing to a lot of people who feel that politics have stagnated a bit.
Well, I think we have examples all over Europe and beyond of electorates being impatient, frustrated, and responding by shifting the voting patterns. As I tried to explain earlier, I mean, when I was growing up in Ireland in the 1960s, 70s, and even into the 80s, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael between them had something in the order of 80% of the total vote at election time. So it was a remarkably stable political system where you had essentially two big centre parties that shared power between them for, well, in fact, since the foundation of the state, one of those two parties has always been in power. And more recently, in coalition arrangements of various descriptions, but they've always been in power. And this has provided an extraordinary degree of continuity in Irish politics, in the sense that, we have had an unbroken 100 years of stable government, centre party rule, even in the years after the Civil War, when you might have expected, when, for example, Fianna Fáil replaced what's now Fine Gael in government in 1932, 10 years after the Fianna Fáil people had been defeated in the Civil War. There was a peaceful transfer of power at that time. So we've had 100 years of stable parliamentary democratic rule, and that is no small thing in 20th century Europe, where, as we all know, movements of the extreme very often came to power and caused enormous disruption. We never had that political disruption in Ireland. Now, Sinn Féin does represent a different style of politics. It's distinctly to the left. I mean, think of it that Ireland has a Labour Party, which has been in business for the last 100 years. They have never been a majority party in government. They've always been, whenever they've been in government, they've always had a minority status. So they've been a minor partner, they've been a junior partner in a coalition government. The way things are at the moment, the odds seem to favour Sinn Féin being the majority party in a future government. And that is a substantial change, to think that, because Sinn Féin are clearly, in their policy platform, are clearly to the left of the Labour Party. And yet Ireland's never had a government dominated by the Labour Party, and may at some time in the future, although remember, we still have 2+ years to go before the next election, so nothing's guaranteed and things can change, and public opinion is volatile, electoral fortunes can swing up and down. But at the moment, the opinion polls seem to suggest that Sinn Féin will have something in the order of 30% plus of the vote at the next election, which would mean that it would be difficult but not impossible to form a government without Sinn Féin being involved.
Jude, you spoke a little bit about how housing is driving this sort of resurgence of Sinn Féin. You also wrote an article recently about rising dissatisfaction among young people. Are we likely to see them continue to drive this political change in Ireland, or, as you alluded to in that article, is emigration likely to come into play?
Um, well, I mean, a lot of the people that I've spoken to anecdotally, really, people you speak to in the street or people that you know, young people are considering leaving, but not immediately necessarily. It's when they finish their course, if they're studying, or perhaps, I mean, and a lot of the case, a lot of times they don't really want to, but they feel they're being driven to it. Now, the government's just had a very big giveaway budget. I don't think that's done enough to convince young people to stay. So I think we will see a rise in immigration among young people, which is something that there've often been waves of emigration in Ireland from the middle of the 19th century, in the famine, and then in times of economic distress. This is different because the Irish economy is booming, but it's a sense that young people just can't afford to live in their country much as they would want to. So I think that's something that Sinn Féin have tapped into extremely successfully. It's a time. I mean, the Taoiseach who will come in on December the 15th, Leo Varadkar, is young, openly gay, was the embodiment when he was Taoiseach the first time around, a few years back. He was the embodiment really of a sort of a youthful hope. And the rest of the political class, in the traditional parties, there are some standout women ministers and younger ministers, but generally speaking, it seems to be a lot of middle-aged white men. Whereas Sinn Féin has managed to sort of chime with the zeitgeist in a way, in the sense they've got women leaders north and south. The party obviously is based in the south, and Mary Lou McDonald is the leader, but the party in the north is also led by a woman who will become the first minister of Northern Ireland if the Northern Ireland government can get back up and running. Currently, because of a row over the Northern Ireland Protocol stemming from Brexit, that's not the case. It's not functioning. So, in a sense, Sinn Féin are able to present themselves as a party that's really very much more in tune with young people's votes. They're saying all the right things that young people want to hear, and young people are fed up of being fobbed off, really. But the other big thing that we didn't talk about when we were just talking about Sinn Féin there is the one thing that they stand for completely unequivocally, and that is a united Ireland. And they are pushing for a border poll, which is a referendum to be held on the future constitutional status of Northern Ireland. And they want to see a successful border poll within a decade, meaning some form of united Ireland. By some form, I say some form because we don't quite know what form that might take, because it's I think, despite there appearing to be a bit of momentum towards a border poll growing, we're not there yet, and preparation really in earnest hasn't begun on either side to just sort of think about the issues that would need to be thought about. But again, I think that's also something that younger people and younger voters might have a different view of. If you were born after the end of the Troubles, the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, or if you grew up then, the sort of the historical, the weight of history in Northern Ireland, the Sinn Féin's association with the IRA really don't matter to you as much as they might do for older voters.
I have to say, I have some doubts about the analysis there of the salience of the immigration issue. I mean, what you have to remember in Ireland is that immigration today is not what it was in the past, where people left Ireland and essentially never came back. These days, people go back and forth. I mean, when Irish people move to London or somewhere in Britain, they don't see themselves as immigrating. They probably come home half a dozen times a year. So it's not the same process as before. The other thing is, I have my doubts that many Irish people will, where will people emigrate to? America is no longer really open to any significant number of Irish people. Of course, you can go to anywhere in the European Union, or you can go to Britain, but going to a European country means having to acquire another language, which I think is a very good thing, and I hope more Irish people, will choose to spend time in a European Union country, because that would be very good for our future in terms of being integrated more fully with our continental European partners in the European Union. But I mean, when I was in London as ambassador, what I was hearing then was that Irish people, younger Irish people there, were planning to move back to Ireland because they didn't care for some of the political atmospherics of Brexit Britain, and Brexit Britain is a work in progress, and let's see how it goes economically in the coming years. So immigration has always got to do with a mix of domestic economic circumstances, coupled with the opportunities that exist to go to more attractive places as an immigrant or as a temporary migrant. So my suspicion is that this is a short-term problem. The housing problem is a problem that can and will be resolved by. I mean, it's all a legacy of the crisis of 2009, 10, 11, when our property industry essentially collapsed, and we were building in the period in the middle of the first decade of the 21st century. Ireland was building 90,000 houses a year for a population of less than 5 million, an extraordinary number. We were building not many fewer houses than Britain was building for a vastly larger population. That was an unsustainable situation. The crash came, and we went down to building 5,000 or 10,000 houses a year. It's now come up to a more respectable figure, but there is a backlog. There is a shortage of housing, certainly, but that is a shortage that can be rectified. And in my experience, a lot of Irish people, if they emigrate, want to come back. And in recent years, in fact, we've seen more people coming back than we've seen people leaving. And we've also seen people coming from other parts of the world to live in Ireland. And by the way, in the census results that were announced recently, the population of Ireland is now over 5 million for the first time since 1851. So I don't think it's credible to talk about a country devastated or likely to be devastated by immigration. Irish people will always have a tendency to go abroad. We're an island. I think it's a good thing that people should emigrate for a time. But I don't think we're going to see the kind of flows of immigrants that we saw in the earlier periods in the 50s and again in the 80s, because the opportunities in Ireland are now up there pretty much equal to what they are in other parts of Europe.
I just want to quickly say we will talk about unification later on in the episode. So if Jude, I'm glad you come back in now, but if it's on unification, we're going to have to save it for later.
Yeah. No, I was just going to jump in and say that I completely agree with Dan there, and that I don't see people as feeling that they're sort of exiled away from their home and they'll never be able to come back. I think there's two things. Younger people are probably more likely to work in the gig economy or not want to immediately, perhaps in their early 20s, perhaps not lock themselves into a career, and so feel that they're more mobile. And so this inability at the moment to find a place to live or to feel that they can afford to live in their country sort of goes hand in hand with wanting to go abroad and get some experience. And the other thing is just that one very popular destination for young professionals is Dubai, and that's because perhaps they can go there and save money, and it's seen as it's a very sort of transactional thing. They go there, they can save the money for a deposit for a house, and so it's seen as a very practical use of a couple of years or a few years. So I agree with Dan completely that they're not going never to come back, and it's sort of seen as a way of affording being able to stay in some cases.
And I think the flip side to that economic transformation of a country is the social revolution that's been going on, if you can call it such. The passage of the 34th Amendment allowed same-sex marriage in Ireland, which was quite the news. There's a relaxation of abortion laws facing review this year. It wasn't so long ago that Ireland was being understood as the country of devout Catholics controlled by its priests. I remember watching as a young boy Father Ted on television in thought that was a good depiction of Ireland. But is how can we explain this transformation? Because it seems from the outside pretty remarkable. Is there a link? Is it linked with economic growth? Is it some kind of maybe resentment at the control of the church, with, or especially all the stories that came out on pedophilia and so on? Ambassador, how do you explain this quite remarkable transformation in 2 decades?
Yeah, well, let me have a go at that. I see four factors at play here. The first is the economic transformation of Ireland. When Ireland joined the European Union in 1973, our per capita wealth levels were about 60% of the then European average. Now, depending on how you count, but whatever way you count or you estimate our national wealth, we are on a per capita basis above the European average. So that's been a total economic transformation of Ireland. A second factor is our membership of the European Union, which I think has definitely broadened perspectives, has definitely changed horizons for Irish people. It's brought us into contact with countries that have different histories and different ways of doing things than what we have, and I think we've learned from that experience, and also, I mean, European Union policy in many cases drove social change. For example, equal work for equal pay was a policy that was introduced at the behest of the European Union back in the 1970s. So that's been an important factor, the Europeanization of Ireland. Thirdly, the educational revolution. I am a product of that generation. In the late 1960s, the then Irish government decided to make second level education free of charge, high school education free of charge. That dramatically increased the number of Irish people finishing school. I was the first year of that educational revolution. And then 5 years later, many more people from my age group went on to university, as I did. And I was the first member of my family ever to go to university. And that was a common phenomenon in the Ireland of the early 1970s. So that educational revolution now means that about 60% of Irish school leavers go on to third level education. We've just recently created a number of new universities. So higher education has become, the norm rather than the exception. And then finally, the scandals in the church have definitely eroded confidence in the Catholic Church, which is now struggling to attract churchgoers. It's struggling to attract people to the priesthood and the religious life. So all of those things combined have totally transformed the mentality of Ireland in this 21st century to a point which would make it unrecognizable from the Ireland of my childhood and even the Ireland of the late 20th century.
Jude, on top of that, of those transformations, how linked is that phenomenon with the rise of Sinn Féin?
I mean, I think all of those things didn't necessarily have to pave the way for Sinn Féin to gain ground. All of those things could have happened. The traditional parties, and we've only seen the rise of Sinn Féin really in the last couple of years, to the sustained growth to the point that they're looking at leading the next government. Up until then, their results, they might have had a good election, a local election, or a different sort of election, but not necessarily. Not necessarily a sustained performance at every single electoral outing. So I don't necessarily think that they're 100% correlated, but obviously, things like you mentioned same-sex marriage, abortion, referendum. These are things that younger people have views on, and younger people are a good percentage of the support of Sinn Féin. But I think the interesting thing in Sinn Féin as well is that they've managed to broaden out their support base, not just to the to younger people, but beyond that, not just working class people, but into middle class, into university educated people, and into middle aged people. Um, so I think it's part of the story, perhaps not the entire story. But could Sinn Féin? I suppose the flip side is, could Sinn Féin have risen without those things? And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think Sinn Féin's been on a big journey of transformation, really. The end of the Troubles, the conflict in Northern Ireland, and the gradual reinvention of Sinn Féin, and the fact that they have a um, very sort of personable leader, a very charismatic leader, compared to um, somebody who was very much associated with the Troubles, who was leading the party before. I think that has also really helped relaunch Sinn Féin in the popular mind.
I want to pivot a little bit away from the domestic situation now that we've sort of talked about enough about Irish's politics. Um, let's talk about Irish soft power. I'm recording from the United States, where the presence of Irish culture is ubiquitous. I even play for a rugby team in Washington called the Washington Irish. Um, but Ireland's cultural footprint extends beyond just what's in the United States. It has a very strong soft power influence globally. Ambassador, what do you think is driving that?
Well, I mean, I teach Irish studies at New York University at the moment, and I have one Chinese student in my class and one student of Indian descent, an American of Indian descent. Yes, Ireland's culture does have an appeal beyond our shores. That is for certain. And I, having been ambassador in the past, I'm now retired, of course, in Malaysia, in Germany, in London, and in Washington, I've seen for myself just how the Irish culture has spread around the globe, and you get people who have no Irish background. During the pandemic, we got in touch with a young dancer in Virginia, an African American woman who does brilliant Irish dancing. She's become a bit of a TikTok sensation, Morgan Bullock. So, yes, I think we're fortunate, first of all, that our culture, initially our literature, through the great era of Irish literature of Yeats and Joyce, O'Casey, Synge, and so forth, a lot of our writers attracted an international appeal. In more recent times, of course, you've seen the phenomenon of river dance and Irish dancing becoming a global phenomenon, and people all over the world applying themselves to Irish dancing, even though they may have had no Irish links in the past. So we call that the affinity diaspora. But I think most important from the point of view that we're talking about now is the existence in America of Irish America. Now, you never hear anybody talk about German America or Swedish America or Norwegian America, although those countries have very significant diasporas here in the United States. The Irish diaspora has remained connected with Ireland in ways that I think are very impressive. They were instrumental in the 19th century in supporting Ireland's drive for independence, in various ways, mainly financially, the Irish, and also by putting pressure on the American authorities to support independence for Ireland, and therefore to make Britain have to think about the reaction in America if they were to crack down too heavily on the Irish independence movement. Then, during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, Irish Americans, in the name of Ted Kennedy and others, were very active in pushing the Clinton administration to become directly involved. And Clinton eventually appointed George Mitchell as his envoy, and Mitchell brokered the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. I had the privilege of being there as part of the Irish delegation at that time for that historic agreement. And in more recent times, you've seen Irish American politicians galvanizing themselves to push back against efforts or against developments in Ireland that would damage the Good Friday Agreement through the consequences of Brexit, and pushing back against any notion of having to have a border on the island of Ireland, and insisting that that Britain should abide by the terms of the Protocol in Northern Ireland. So you have a historic tradition there of Irish American interest in, enthusiasm for, admiration for, and affinity with Ireland, which has been politically very valuable to us, especially now when there's a president in the White House who identifies himself as an Irish American, is proud of his Irish American heritage, and that has to be a factor in the minds of people in Britain when they come to decide what to do about the Northern Ireland Protocol. So I think it all has to do with the history of Irish emigration and the fact that Irish people, when they left Ireland in the 19th century and beyond, felt that they had a cause left behind in Ireland that they wanted to support, and that support has continued for the last 150 years.
I mean, I don't really have a great deal to add to that. I think it summed it up very well. It certainly is very notable that Ireland has this particular ability to call on the US, to be friends with the US, to have inroads into the White House that other countries, France, Germany, whatever, might give their eye teeth for. And and it's done in a very careful way. I'd say also that there's sort of cultural phenomena, Irish pubs worldwide, the exports, the Guinness, the whiskies, things like this that Ireland has. I mean, it's all built a very strong brand, which Ireland leverages very, very well. But certainly, next year we're coming up to the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, which ended the Troubles, and the US government has let it be known to the UK government very strongly that they do want the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol, this row that's going on that has paralysed political institutions and complicated trade for some people and facilitated trade for other people in Northern Ireland, that the US want that to be fixed by then. And any prospect of a UK-US trade deal in the wake of Brexit is on the back burner for now and has no prospect of getting onto the front burner until this situation is resolved. So Ireland has an ace up its sleeve in many ways.
I want to pivot to Europe. We'll come back to specifically the question of Brexit in our Patreon-only moment at the end of the interview. But on Europe, it seems that Ireland is also capable of punching above its weight, very much like it does on the international scene. It has representatives in senior positions in the EU, in the ECB. Ambassador, what are the objectives, the key kind of strategic objectives that Ireland always focuses on? Is it about pushing personnel? Is it about strategic interests? Is it about all the fiscal debates? What are kind of the key strategic focus of Ireland at the European level? And perhaps also, without talking about Brexit specifically, how has the departure of the UK changed Ireland's position in the EU? Because it seems to me that the UK leaving the EU also means that Ireland is now a lot more under the spotlight for its stance on fiscal matters, and the UK is no longer capable or is no longer here to play the bad cop role, a role which it adored playing most famously with Margaret Thatcher back in the days, of course.
Yes, well, I mean, first of all, I remember, I'm old enough to remember, because I'm retired now, I'm old enough to remember the referendum in 1972 when Ireland decided to join the European Union by a vote of 80-20, I think it was, if I remember correctly. And at that time, we joined because the feeling was we had no alternative because Britain was joining. Within 6 years, Ireland had decided to join the European exchange rate mechanism, which meant breaking the link with sterling. So the history of Ireland's membership of the European Union is of Ireland very rapidly embracing the opportunities and the horizons presented by European Union membership. And from that time onwards, whenever was a choice to be made between our relationship with Britain on the one hand and our involvement in the European Union project, we chose the European route. We did that when it came to joining the European, the euro currency, and that has benefited Ireland greatly because until we joined the euro, our currency was, well, before we joined the ERM in 1979, our currency was tied to sterling, and we had no say whatsoever. Now we have Irish people at the heart of the European Central Bank. The Irish Finance Minister, Pascal Donoghue, is the president of the Eurogroup. So now Ireland commands influence at the heart of the European Union. But that's been because of a progressive set of decisions by the Irish government and the Irish people, who decided in referendums to go along with the progress of European integration, to throw our lot in with the European Union and not to be tied to our erstwhile relationship with the UK.
Well, interestingly, Dan just referenced there the fact that the finance minister of Ireland is the chair of the Eurogroup, the finance ministers of the Euro nations, and Leo Varadkar, the current deputy prime minister, who will take over as prime minister Taoiseach on the 15th of December, he said recently that this is the most important position an Irish person holds in Europe and shouldn't be squandered. Unfortunately, that could well turn out to be a casualty of the musical chairs government arrangement, because the role is personal. It's the chair of the Eurogroup is elected by the other Eurogroup members, as opposed to just belonging to the finance minister of a particular nation, and therefore can't really rotate when the current finance minister steps aside. And so there's been a row recently about whether or not the finance minister, if he moves into a different role, whether he could take the Eurogroup chair with him or not. And there's been backlash from the coalition partners on that. So basically, I think the upshot of this likely situation is that Ireland will probably end up not being able to hold on to the presidency of the Eurogroup. But the very fact that Ireland held it, it may be more symbolic. It may be the kind of job that obviously Ireland has an EU commissioner, and the chief economist of the central bank is Irish, but having this position certainly put Ireland in a seat at the top table when, for example, last year there were very important discussions on hammering out a new global tax deal, which will see Ireland's tax, historically low or lower than others, tax rate rise. And Ireland's finance minister was able to be a nexus there between Europe and the US, and move between those two worlds because of this position. So it's certainly, and that feeds into what we were talking about earlier about soft power. I mean, it perhaps has been able to give Ireland in that role. Maybe it's been allowed Ireland to punch a little bit above Ireland's weight.
Yeah, well, the other thing that I wanted to say is that, yes, we have made a determined effort to encourage Irish people to join the institutions as officials of the European Union. And we had 12 years, unbroken years, when Irish-born people, Catherine Day and then David O'Sullivan, were at the helm of the European Commission, the top civil servants in the European Commission. So that was certainly a major win for Ireland, and we continue to try to encourage Irish people to go in and to work in the European institutions. And then secondly, we made a decision there a number of years ago to have an embassy in all 27 member states. And I think at one stage we were one of the few, we were certainly the only smaller country that actually decided that we should have representation in all 27 EU capitals. So what that meant was, when the Brexit situation arose, we were able to lobby directly through a full network of embassies in each member state to put forward the Irish view. I have been impressed by the solidarity that has come to Ireland from the European Union. I believe that the British government in 2016 believed that it could essentially negotiate a deal that would be ideally suited to Britain's needs. And it came up against sharp resistance from the European Union, especially when it came to the situation in Northern Ireland. I'm sure that was a shock to Britain to discover that Ireland and Ireland's interests were being prioritised by the European Union, despite the disparity in size and power between Ireland and the UK.
we're going to talk in more detail about relations between the UK and Ireland for our Patreon subscribers. So if you would like to hear that extended conversation about the negotiations between the European Union and the UK over Brexit and from that Irish perspective, please subscribe to our Patreon and you'll get access to that full conversation.
So, Julian, Ambassador Daniel Mulhall and Financial Times correspondent in Dublin, Jude Weber, are out. What did you make of this really fascinating, quite deep actually conversation, especially towards the end in the Patreon part on the state of Irish politics? Given all the turmoil, given the whole conversation about Brexit, and the death of the Queen, it was quite an interesting moment in Irish politics.
Yes, it was a fascinating discussion, and the sort of range of topics that we were able to cover both on the domestic front and then that more detailed discussion in the subscriber-only segment on Irish unification. But I just want to sort of pause and look at Irish politics in general, because part of what I love about the conversations we're able to have is that we can talk about these broader themes affecting European politics. And one thing that you hear all the time and you read all the time is about a crisis in democracy. I'm in the United States. People are talking about a crisis of credibility in certain institutions. That's true in other countries across Europe. Ireland has a unique model where constitutional amendments are decided by referenda. And a lot of those progressive changes that we talked about at the start of the episode, at least, whether it was on same-sex marriage, getting rid of blasphemy laws, have all been done by referenda. And I think that popular engagement is something that a lot of other countries in Europe can learn from.
Those referenda end up with pretty progressive outcomes. But there's a country that does something similar in Europe, and it's Switzerland. And the results of those referenda are actually pretty reactionary, generally, especially on issues on immigration, on Islam. There was a very famous referendum on the minarets on the mosques in Switzerland about a decade ago. So it's interesting that in Ireland, those referenda produced some pretty progressive outcomes.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating. It speaks to sort of the individual cultures of each country, but sort of embracing their own model of deciding key questions and getting change that perhaps the citizens are more keen to see. We talked about the rise of Sinn Féin and how that is stemming, or at least Jude Weber said that it was stemming mostly from a core policy issue over housing. Many countries are facing housing crises and affordability of housing crises. And the fact that in Ireland, that's what's driving the surge in support for a party that hasn't really been in government is quite interesting, and a bit of a contrast to some of the other countries in Europe that are facing a bit of political turmoil or seeing those insurgent parties rise up in the polls.
Yeah, so I've been looking for housing in London this summer, and as I was doing it, one of my friends sent me this tweet that really blew up. It was like 100 people lined up to visit an apartment in Dublin, and apparently that's the new norm now. I mean, just like a huge line, a huge queue. I mean, like second longest queue I've seen this summer after the queue to see Queen Elizabeth. It's absolutely ludicrous.
And I suppose probably some Irish people were in that queue to see Queen Elizabeth, as we touched upon in that Patreon discussion about Irish unification. I think just one other aspect I was going to quickly mention is the nature of the political coalition of two former rivals divided really since the Anglo-Irish Civil War in the 1920s, joining up in government with similar enough ideological overlap, but divided on that fundamental question of whether they were pro-treaty or anti-treaty during the Irish Civil War. And the handover agreement, the fact that that's actually going to take effect on December 15th, barring some extraordinary development, when most people didn't think this coalition would last, it's Ireland adopting that more European model of coalition governments from different spectrums. When Britain had its Conservative Lib Dem coalition, a lot of commentators didn't think it would last the full 5 years. Similar commentary in Ireland for the Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael coalition, but it's lasting, and the handover is still set to happen. One country that did have a similar one, slightly outside of Europe, depending on your perspective, but Israel, when it had a power sharing agreement between Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud and Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party, that never made it to the transition. It never made it to the handover. But this one did, showing that there's the degree of cooperation in Irish politics is certainly a positive.
On paper, I mean, it's interesting because actually I love looking at polls. It's one of my favorite things to do, and see how they evolved and see how they've evolved over the past 10, 15 years. And so you look at a Fianna Fáil in Fine Gael, and you're like, on paper, you're trying to find the differences. I mean, from the outside, obviously I'm not Irish. I've only been to Dublin once, or Ireland twice. From the outside, the differences feel minuscule, They're both kind of roughly centrist, centre-right. One is perhaps more of a Christian Democrat. One is more of a liberal party, but debatable. And then you understand, it's about the treaty. One party 100 years ago decided the treaty wasn't good, and the other one decided, well, that's good enough. And that still influences politics to this day. Now, what is obvious now is with Sinn Féin being so influential, they can no longer afford to have this kind of divide, which no longer seems to matter as much in modern Irish politics, given the time that has gone through. But yeah, it's just a kind of fascinating survival of kind of old political division, which seem to be kind of less and less important. There's something else I want to talk about, because we talked a lot about, especially in the Patreon section, about the prospects of a unification of Ireland. And I think something we didn't talk enough about is obviously that can't really happen without London allowing a referendum to be held. And I mean, at this point, it's really hard to project anything in British politics, given the predicted state of the Conservative Party in the next election. I actually run a prediction on the Electoral Map website, which gave the Conservatives, I think, like, I don't know, 100 seats, something like that. And so, like, people like Boris Johnson, Richie Sunak would all lose their seats. I mean, it'd be an absolute bloodbath. So obviously, they're probably at that worst right now. They could bounce back. But if we manage to get away from kind of short term where it's hard to see any further than the next week, in order for reunification to happen, you would need a referendum. And why I think that's going to be really hard is, I think people underestimate the kind of impact, the growing impact of the DUP in British politics. Because the way I was reading something this summer on the French war in Algeria, the Algerian War of Independence. And I was actually quite struck to see how the lobbies of the settlers, the French, but also Italian settlers, the people who had settled in Algeria, the way they were forcing Paris to hold much more maximalistic positions during the Algerian conflict. They were much more distrustful of the locals, the Algerians, but also they were convinced that Paris would abandon them whenever they get the opportunity. And I think the DUP lives in a kind of similar, slightly paranoid state, with the idea that if they don't push very forcefully for the union, London is just going to abandon them at every turn. I'm not saying they're wrong. In the case of Algeria, the settlers were obviously right, because in the end, Charles de Gaulle gave independence to, or at least a referendum that led to independence in Algeria. And there's a case that maybe if it wasn't for the DUP, London would have separated Northern Ireland from the rest of Great Britain much faster. But I think we have to take that into account. The DUP is going to be a force that is going to do whatever it can to stop unification, because they're perhaps understandably paranoid that there would be a kind of oppressed minority in a grand unified Ireland.
That's the stance they're going to take, and it was the maximum stance that they took, especially when they had leverage over the May government following the 2017 election, in which she lost her majority and had to rely on a confidence and supply arrangement with the DUP, giving them an effective veto over any Brexit deal that she negotiated, crucially speaking, the one that included the Northern Ireland Protocol that has caused so much consternation. And then Boris Johnson, who of course had voted against May's deal, won a resounding majority and immediately backed May's deal, thus condemning the DUP to silence on the issue because they weren't needed in government anymore. And, it's exactly what you're pointing to. They forced a maximalist position on the British government, who needed them in order to pass basic legislation. And the result is that Ireland is closer to unification today than it was in, I'll go with January 2019, when I think it was May's biggest defeat on her deal. But really around that time. And that's part of the DUP's pressure campaign on May, has put that situation in order.
Well, thanks a lot, Julian, for this fascinating conversation. I really do recommend you join us on our Patreon to listen to the second half of the interview, which was incredibly insightful on the prospects of unification, and I think more generally, the way Brexit has kind of changed the entire conversation in Ireland. It's really, really insightful to get the Irish perspective, because I think we all have heard about the British perspective for quite a lot, but that kind of the other side of the mirror is quite interesting as well. So if you like the episode, definitely do consider to join us on our Patreon.
Yes, and just one other thing I'll say on that before we jump off is, obviously I am British. You spend a lot of time in London, and much of the news that people get about Brexit is coming from British newspapers, whether they're sympathetic to Brexit or strongly opposed. But that Irish perspective, and particularly Ambassador Mulhall, or former Ambassador Mulhall, I should say, who was in London on June 23rd, 2016, when Britain voted to leave, and to get that perspective from him on Anglo-Irish relations was really, really interesting, at least for me, because it's something that, I remember during the referendum campaign, it barely came up. Nobody talked about Ireland. Everybody talked about Turkey, but nobody talked about Ireland.
Yep. Yeah, I remember having those conversations with you, and we did not talk about Ireland, that's for sure. Anyways, thank you so much to everyone for listening to us. Thank you so much for all the support. There's been so many downloads over the past few days after we released our season premiere. We're really excited about it. As you can see, we've really done a conscious effort to make it as professional as we can. And we're so excited for the next few weeks. So please stay tuned. And if you want more content, including our monthly book club, please do consider joining us on our Patreon. Anyways, thank you to everyone, and see you all next week.
See you next week.